This lecture will talk about responsibility centers. So we're now moving to the nitty-gritty or the details of management control. Okay. So where are we in the discussion of management control? Recall that in the previous sessions, we discussed the definition of management control. We also defined the goals of an organization because that's the point B that we need to arrive at in management control. We also talked about the behavior of employees, because the idea behind management control is we have to ensure that employees are able to implement strategy and their goals are aligned so that their goals is congruent with management's goals. So these are the topics that we have discussed so far. Now, under responsibility centers, the question is now, how should accountabilities be organized for the business context? Okay, so now we're starting to put in the architecture of management control. And as far as the architecture of management control is concerned, at the end of the day, it is based on the assignment of accountabilities. And the way accountabilities are assigned in an organization, ang skeleton nun is called the responsibility center. Okay? When you try now to measure the accountabilities and check whether accountabilities have been fulfilled at the end of the year, yun yung tinatawag naman ngayon na responsibility accounting. Okay? So tahi-tahi yan, no? Because of the goals of the organization, those goals need to be assigned to people within the organization. And you design that people, the assignment of accountabilities is under the context of a responsibility center. Parang yun yung skeleton of all accountabilities within the organization. And once accountabilities are assigned in that responsibility center, then we're able to keep track now of the measures. Now, when we do a final accounting of whether those measures are being were hit or not, then we are now at the context of responsibility accounting. So that's where we are so we're now leaving the parang fundamentals or the backdrop of management control. We're now delving into management control already. And the first lesson or the first concept that we need to do is to establish the skeleton of the management control system, which is to establish the accountabilities within the organization. Okay? And it starts with assigning responsibility centers. So what are responsibility centers? A responsibility center is an organizational unit that is headed by a manager who is responsible for its activities. So essentially, three basic ideas: organizational unit that is headed by a manager and is responsible for a set of activities. Okay? Why is it important that it is headed by a manager? There's a manager na component, sa definition of responsibility centers, because this manager will be the accountable person. Someone has to be accountable on the tasks or activities of that organizational unit. The way tasks are designed within an organization and the way those tasks are assigned to a manager who is accountable to the delivery of the task, that design is called the responsibility center. So the idea is if each responsibility center meets its objectives, then the organization will achieve its overall strategy. Okay? It should be designed that way, that if everyone hits their targets, the organization hits its overall target. Otherwise, there's something wrong with accountabilities within the organization. Okay? So kung satisfactory ang performance ng lahat, tapos yung organization as a whole red or hindi na-achieve yung total objective, then there's something wrong on how accountabilities are distributed within an organization. Okay? So responsibility centers' objectives, they stack up and enable the organization to achieve its strategy. So now we're going down the line na. Kasi in strategy setting, tinignan natin yung overall strategies of organizations. Tinignan natin yung overall measures. Na-design na natin yon. Pero now we go granular into the organization. So given na ito yung set of strategies, no, o at the organization level or business unit level, kailangan na ngayon tingnan at the department level or division level or section level. Because all of those are responsibility centers, pockets of activities assigned to managers, right? So that's one responsibility that is parang they're all clumped together. That's why it's a center, right? And those set of responsibilities are delivered by an accountable person. So that's what responsibility centers are. Okay. Now, the responsibility centers are closely intertwined with the organization structure. So parang usually the organizational structure of a company, that is also the blueprint for the responsibility centers within the company. Now, syempre, the way a company is organized, dependent din yan sa tasks within the company. And each of those tasks have required output. That output need to be assigned to accountable people. No? So the normal way to look at responsibility centers is for it to be embedded into the organization structure. However, I'm saying that that's not always the case. Okay? The default is you embed the responsibility center to the organization structure, but sometimes it might be different. Okay? So if you look at this simple organizational structure for a company, so you have the head office, there are two divisions, no, for this organization, Division A and Division B. So Division A has two business units, and one business unit has a sales unit, production unit, and an R&D unit. Okay, so each of these boxes can be a structure for us to define that each of those boxes have a responsibility or task to do, right? And therefore, one box in the organization structure is also one responsibility center. So let's look at this. No? At the business unit level, say business unit 2, no, it could be defined as a profit center, meaning a center wherein they are responsible with profits, which is revenues and expenses. So ibig sabihin, yung manager at this level, accountable siya to profit, to deliver the profit of the organization. No? However, if you're the manager at the level of the sales unit, you cannot be asked to be accountable to profit, right? Kasi hindi mo naman kontrolado lahat. Sales unit ka lang, sales department ka lang. If you're this manager, manager B. Okay? So you cannot be accountable to the whole profit of the company, right? You're only accountable to a portion of the company's profit and loss. And in this case, in sales unit yan, revenue center ang tawag doon. Now, ibang tao or ibang unit or ibang box within the organization ang accountable sa other parts of the expenses of the company. So the manager of the production unit might be an expense center. Accountable siya to expenses. The manager of the R&D unit might be accountable to another set of expenses, R&D expenses. So these are called cost centers, no, or expense centers. No? So individually, these three business units at the end of the org structure, they're accountable to different parts of P&L, but the manager at the business unit 2 level is accountable for the whole P&L. No? So therefore, may oversight si business 2 manager, no, sa mga different units under him. Okay? And Division A or the head office can be investment centers. Investment centers are accountable for P&L plus asset investment. What does that imply? Ibig sabihin, si business unit 2 manager, hindi niya control ang asset investments. Kasi profit center lang, profit and loss lang accountability niya. So, therefore, hindi niya madidictate kung dapat bang mag-expand yung operations kasi asset investment na yun eh. Right? Ang nagde-decide doon is Division A. Kasi siya yung investment center dito. Okay? So, that's how organizational structures are embedded into responsibility centers. Responsibility centers are embedded into the organization structures of an entity. Now, of course, you can further disaggregate responsibilities in this organization. right? How you assign responsibilities within different units within an organization structure, that is the responsibility center assessment. Okay? So what's the context of a responsibility center? Okay? So a responsibility center um, has a core operation always. Okay? And when we say a responsibility center has a core operation, meron siyang tatlong portions. Okay? A responsibility center processes inputs, works on it, and produces output. Okay? So kung walang input, walang output, or walang processing, hindi siya isang responsibility center. Right? Otherwise, where is the accountability needed? Diba? No? In this process, itong input, work, and output, there are various accountabilities that can be embedded in this simple process. Right? What are the accountabilities? Number one, availability of inputs. Right? Kasi kailangan may inputs para you can work on it, and therefore the output should be, and therefore it results to a satisfactory output. So that's one accountability, di ba? Availability of input. Second, no, efficiency of work. Once you have the input, no, are you working on it efficiently? Are you processing it efficiently? Kasi it uses resources if you work on your inputs. And what's the third accountability? Third simple accountability. Output, effectiveness of output or quality of output. May input ka nga, na-work mo nga efficiently, paglabas, sira-sira. Paglabas, palya yung quality. Right? So one responsibility center has an input and they have to work on those inputs and produce necessary outputs. Of course, it's easy to imagine this in terms of a production facility, for example. Input is materials, you work on it through labor and equipment, ang paglabas, finished goods. So madaling imaginein. Right? But for other line organizations, there's also an input, work, and output. Say, accounting, the accounting function. Ano ang resources ng accounting function? Manpower costs, right? Inputs niya in terms of cost is also accounting systems, right? There's also input in terms of human resources. Okay? They do the work. No? They process the information. What is the output of the accounting department? Reports, right? Financial statements, variance analysis, variance versus budget reports. So those are the outputs. So the accounting department, even though it's not producing anything to be sold to outside parties, no, has an input, has a processing stage, and an output. So the accounting department can be one responsibility center. Now, it could be tested in smaller units in the organization. Yung messenger mo ba, isang, no, kunyari may isa kang messenger. Yung messenger na yon, responsibility center ba yon? Ang tanong lang, may input ba siya, may work, and may output? Probably yes. Okay. But later, we'll talk about whether it's efficient to actually shrink the responsibility centers to that extent. Okay. I've already talked about this, but of course, you need to measure the performance of any responsibility center. And measurement of performance is usually classified into two, which is efficiency and effectiveness. Okay. Of course, these two concepts are different. Efficiency refers to the ratio of outputs to inputs or the amount of output per unit of input. So let's draw it. No? So you have an input, right? You want to process it, and then there is an output. Okay? If you're talking about efficiency, your objective is to minimize the input to produce the same level of output. Okay? Or for the same level of output, of input, increase the output. Okay? So you basically, it deals about the ratio of outputs to inputs. You want to minimize that or optimize that, no, as much as possible. Okay. The second general measure is effectiveness. An efficient operation is not necessarily effective. Okay? Kasi pwedeng tipid ka nga in terms of resources, pero yung output mo, hindi naman katanggap-tanggap. Right? Effectiveness is determined by the relationship between the output and its objectives. Ano bang gustong mangyari doon sa output? Yung output ba in line with what it is intended to be, right? So for example, quality of the output. Okay? Yung output ba katanggap-tanggap sa consumer? If yes, then effective yung output. So effective yung isang responsibility center. So for example, marketing programs. Okay? So nag-design ng marketing program. One commercial, nagmumura ang cost ng one commercial. So efficient yung operations. One commercial is cheaper than before. And therefore, the operations is getting more efficient, right? So check sa efficiency. But the commercial might not resonate with the audience. So even though it is efficient, it is not effective. So therefore, responsibilities in centers need to measure both effectiveness and efficiency of performance. Every responsibility center has an efficiency measure and an effectiveness measure. Okay, and so therefore, when we design accountabilities within an organization, we always think about efficiency measures, no? Accountabilities na nagbe-measure sa efficiency ng cost nung center, nung responsibility center. And accountabilities na nagme-measure ng effectiveness of the cost of the responsibility center. No, one is not effective without the other, or one is not sufficient without the other. Okay? So what are the criteria for assigning responsibilities? So nabanggit ko na yung isa, no? Yung core operations of the unit and the measurement possibilities of input and output. First, of course, the first thing that we need to understand is presence, no, of input, work, output in the organization. Okay? Dapat may input, work, output muna. That's the first thing that you need to understand. Okay? But the second thing is ito, measurement possibilities. Possible bang i-measure pa? Oops, sorry. Measurement possibilities. Is it feasible really to measure the efficiency and performance at that level in the organization? So example ko kanina yung messenger, right? Yung messenger, may input, yung time niya, right? May output, ilan ang na-said na sulat or ilan na na-said na documents sa different organization. May work, right? Pina-process na yun, sasakay siya ng jeep or whatever. No? So there is the presence of input, work, and output. However, is it really possible to measure it? No? And is it practical? Possibility, and also look at the practicality of measuring it. Okay? Baka naman hindi na yung practical, nililista pa ni Kuya kung anong oras siya dumating sa bawat pinuntahan niya to check whether efficient ba talaga. Effective ba, nakarating ba dun sa kanyang sa dapat pagbigyan nung papel. So kailangan bang i-determine yun at i-keep track ba yun? Is it practical to do that? Is it possible to do that? If not, then probably the responsibility center is too small. You need to expand it a little. So baka hindi kay Kuya Messenger, but into, for example, siguro meron kayong communications team. No? Then measure it at that level kasi baka mas efficient to also measure it at that level. So there's a trade-off between making all people be accountable to something, okay, and the cost of measuring it also. Kasi hindi naman nagme-make sense na may accountability yung tao, pero hindi mo naman mini-measure. It's also demotivating. Okay? Second, criteria is organization structure. So as I mentioned or alluded in the previous slide, no, the organization structure is the most logical template of how responsibilities are assigned within the organization. And we'll discuss more of this in the next few chapters, no, wherein we'll talk about organization structure talaga. And the last principle is controllability. Dapat kontrolado ng tao yung accountabilities niya. Okay? So controllability is very important in the determination of responsibility center types. Okay? So it's very important. Kasi it links back to our discussion about human behavior. Remember the self-determination theory, right? Under the self-determination theory, humans, they want to self-determine their destiny. And when you self-determine your destiny, the idea of how much of my life can I control, okay? And the amount of control that you have over your own life motivates you, no, is a motivational tool. Okay? So dapat yung accountability niya within the organization, kontrolado niya yung factors that affect the outcome. Because kung kontrolado niya yung factors which affect the outcome, therefore mas magiging motivated siya to fulfill its task pursuant to these concepts, no, about human behavior and about motivation of people. Okay? So, titingnan mo rin na accountabilities that you will be assigning should be commensurate to the or should follow, no, the decision making authority and the controllability of the measure. Para kung bumagsak siya doon sa task, alam niya kasalanan niya. Wala nang ibang sisisihin kasi controlled niya yun eh. Controlled niya yung actions doon. Okay? So there are different types of responsibility centers. One is revenue center. Obviously, the accountability is in terms of revenues. Okay? But let's look at the diagram below. No, this provides a better emphasis of what revenue centers are. Okay? Yung revenue centers, the output is very tangible. The output is revenues. Kita. So that's sales times price. No, that's the output. The output is very tangible and it can be expressed in monetary terms. However, the input is not complete. No? Ang alam lang niya ay yung costs directly incurred by the sales department, for example. Pero marami pang ibang inputs na nag-support sa sales na yan. Ano-ano yun? Production. Right? Ano pang mga cost ang input ng salespeople? E di yung marketing costs. Pero hindi naman nila controlled yun. Yung mga marketing costs and marketing inputs. Right? So they cannot be held accountable for that because they do not control it. So the inputs in revenue centers are very minimal costs. No? And therefore, there is no formal attempt to relate input to output kasi insignificant naman yung costs related to the output. So that's what revenue centers are. What are the key principles for revenue centers? For example, actual sales are measured against budgets or quotas. They're measured against a standard. Okay? Simple and effective way to motivate salespeople to attract and retain customers. Kasi if you designate them as revenue centers, ang focus nila yung output because their input's very minimal, right, from their point of view. So, basta, ang focus nila, benta. So, it's easy to motivate these salespeople, right? You don't have to take care about costs. Maliliit lang yan. Spend what you need to spend. Okay? Right? Important, you deliver the output. Okay? However, since ganun, obviously, there's little incentive to manage expenses and to manage working capital. So they have a tendency to, for example, spend a lot to treat the client, for example, para yung client bumili, right? Or mag-order ng bulk order. So palitson tayo dyan. So ganun, may ganung mentality pag revenue centers because there's little incentive to manage expenses because their responsibility, their toka is sales. So basta may sales, I can justify all the expenses that I want. Sales personnel must also recognize that they are working not only for their own unit, but for the overall good of the company. This is the challenge, these two points. Okay? So that's why we also often complement financial metrics, which is sales versus budget or sales versus quotas, are complemented by non-financial measures. For example, days receivable, day sales outstanding, age of receivables, para ganahan silang magkolekta. Right? Kasi measure din nila yung average collection period, for example. Okay? Or pwedeng measure na, dapat yung expenses mo, X% lang of revenues. Okay? You can spend more as long as you can justify it with higher sales. No? So those are non-financial metrics that could be used to enhance goal congruence for revenue centers. Okay? Expense centers or cost centers are, of course, are responsibility centers whose inputs are measured in monetary terms but whose outputs are not. Baliktad ng revenue centers. Expense centers, yung input niya pera, pero yung output niya hindi pera. Okay? Yung output niya is probably a service. Yung output niya is probably a finished goods. Hindi siya in terms of money, but in terms of an output. Okay? There are two types of expense centers, engineered and discretionary. So engineered expense centers are those for which the right or proper amount can be estimated within a reasonable reliability. We'll talk about that in the next slides. Discretionary, on the other hand, are those which has no engineered estimate and is dependent on the management judgment. An example of an engineered expense is production or manufacturing plant. Okay. So production or manufacturing plant. That is obviously an engineered expense kasi may relationship yung cost that you spend to the outputs, the number of outputs that you have. So yung mga standard costs, dito yan sa engineered expense centers. However, there are expenses which do not have the same relationships between input and output. The classic is of course R&D. Right? R&D expenses. Okay? Those are the classic discretionary expenses. Bakit siya discretionary? Kahit gumasta ka ng gumasta, hindi ibig sabihin dumadami yung R&D. Kasi depende yan, kung naka-jackpot ka ba na meron kang good idea, no? Or gumastos ka ng gumastos as nag-fail. Okay? So those are all discretionary expenses. Okay? Engineered expense centers are usually found in manufacturing operations, as I mentioned. So if you look at it in terms of input and output, the inputs can be measured in monetary terms. Pero yung output physical, number of units, for example, number of hours worked. Okay? It's not expressed in terms of money. Of course, you can also express it in terms of money kasi may inventory costing, right? But pero hindi yun yung ibig nating sabihin here. Ang sinasabi natin, the output is in physical terms. Unlike revenues. Kasi yung revenues, yung output is in monetary terms kasi they can control price and they can control price and they can control volume. Yun yung controllable items nila as revenue centers. Yung engineered expense centers, hindi naman nila nakokontrol yung output kung magkano. Right? Basta kung ano yung lumabas based on the efficiency, no? Yun yung physical terms, okay, or in physical number of units. So the optimum monetary amount of input required to produce 1 unit of output can be determined. And therefore, yung mga pinag-aralan ninyo sa standard costing, variance analysis, no? For direct materials, direct labor, factory overhead, lahat yan are relevant for engineered expenses. Okay? Discretionary expenses, on the other hand, are the support units, administration, R&D, marketing. Bakit siya discretionary? Depende sa strategy, right? So for example, marketing costs. Sometimes marketing costs are huge, sometimes it's not. It depends on the marketing plan, it depends on the strategy of the company. So for example, next year, election year, or this year pala is election year, no? So probably if you're a brand, there could be some increase in costs with respect to advertising, right? Kasi nakukompete sa space lahat, no, sa ad space kasi meron pang mga kandidato, right? So tumaas yung cost. So it's a marketing decision whether okay, sabayan natin yung increase ng cost ng increased budget, or ay wag nating sabayan, tipirin natin yung marketing this year. Ayun nating gumastos ng sobrang laki. Discretionary on the part of the company. The problem with discretionary expense centers is that the output cannot be measured in terms of monetary terms. Okay? Unlike yung engineered, kasi kanina, the output is not monetary, pero nabibilang mo. And you can establish a relationship between the input cost and the output units. Here, since it's discretionary, right, the output is not the consistency of the amount of input and the resulting output cannot be established. That relationship cannot be established. Kasi nga, discretionary. Pwedeng lampas, pwedeng hindi. Okay? And even if hindi siya lumampas, baka yun talaga yung strategy. Right? So, that's the problem with discretionary expenses. Now, how do you plan for discretionary expenses? Of course, managers, for example, legal staff or law office, these administration costs will always strive for functional excellence, meaning gagalingan nila. For example, legal staff or the law department in your company. Of course, ang output nila is to have contracts that are foolproof, right? How can they achieve a contract that is foolproof? The way for them to do it is they can hire more legal staff, perfect legal staff, pay for summa cum laude legal staff. Okay, so nagmamahal, right? So ang sinabi nga sa book is perfect legal staff produces contracts with no flow, right? And so the expenses go huge and huge and huge. Okay? However, that objective might not be goal congruent already, right? Because it's too costly, right? Yung konting mali, konti lang ang cost impact versus the additional legal staff that you need to hire. No? So, ang mahirap sa discretionary expenses, gusto palagi ng mga department, state-of-the-art yung kinuha nila. Right? State-of-the-art or full high quality lahat. Maximum quality lahat. Right? And therefore, there is a risk of empire building. Empire building, yung palaki lang ng organization nila. Just like the legal staff example that I have. Baka 10 lawyers, okay na. Pero kung gusto mo perfect yung contract, 20 lawyers. Kaso the incremental benefit of doubling your legal staff, baka wala na masyado. So hindi na goal congruent. Okay? Also, the control of discretionary expense center depends on the effective establishment of a reference point. In an engineered expense center, di ba may relationship between input costs and output? So for example, you will spend 5 pesos for every unit. That is the relationship. So if you're able to produce the same unit at 4 pesos, positive yun. Right? Kasi you got it at a cheaper price versus the standard. For discretionary expenses, for example, you have a marketing budget of 1 million for 2 commercials. Okay? And then, ang actuals mo, you spent 2 commercials or you piloted 2 commercials but you spent 0.75 million. Okay? Does this mean that na successful or nakatipid ka? Not necessarily. Why? Because the output of these two commercials, okay, might be different. Hindi kasi exactly the same yan eh, yung mga commercial na yan. Therefore, the effectivity might be different. So usually, yung mga cost-related measures complemented by performance-related measures. Kasi dito, yung unit na to, dito sa example natin sa taas, yung mga units na yan, identical units. Pero here, the outputs here, sa baba na example, hindi yan identical. Ang mabibili ng 1 million na commercial, no, ay iba sa mabibili ng 0.75 million na commercial. Okay? And so therefore, even if you spend less, that's not necessarily an indication of good performance. No? For example, another classic example is in the government. Alam niyo ba pag sa government, binigyan ka ng budget, ngari 200 million ng budget ng isang opisina. If you underspend, okay, hindi mataas ang iyong rating. Okay? So kunyari, nag 200 million ng budget mo, at the end of the year, ginastos mo lang 175 million, hindi ka good sa government. Why? Because underspending, okay, means that some programs were not funded. May mga programa yung gobyerno na hindi napondohan or hindi na-implement. Or the money could have been spent to give more services to the people. Pero hindi mo ginawa kasi nag-underspend ka. So that's why underspending is not an indication of good performance in the government. At the same time, for example, pag nag-underspend ka, hindi ka nakatulong sa pump-priming of the economy, right? The budget, the government budget is an economic tool, right? The assumption is if the government spends its budget, it pump-primes the economy. It feeds money into the economy, right? And if a department does not spend its budget, it means money is not circulating, right? So the multiplier effect is not being realized. So under that lens, underspending is not a good thing. And that's my point with respect to discretionary cost centers. Okay. Now, profit centers are responsibility centers na ang kanilang responsibility is profit. So that's revenues and expenses. Of course, a profit center measures both effectiveness and efficiency. Now, anong kinaibahan ng profit center sa investment center? Yung profit center, it has control over assets and revenues and expenses only. But it has no control over asset levels. So they cannot invest in assets, right? Or they cannot sell assets. They cannot improve working capital. Profit and loss lang ang kanilang responsibility. An investment center, on the other hand, no, aside from profit, they also manage assets. They can invest the assets into expansion projects if they want to. They can sell assets if they want to. So there's more controllability there. So that's why profit center, investment centers are different. Profit center, controlled lang niya profit and loss items. So quantity sold, price of the selling price, quantity produced times the manufacturing cost, and then the cost of the discretionary expenses. Yun ang kontrolado ng profit centers. Investment centers, you own plus efficiency of asset use. So they have the power to invest more in assets, sell assets, improve working capital, etc. Okay? So an investment center motivates unit managers to generate adequate profits and to make sure that they invest in additional resources to earn more return. So profit centers usually focus on margins. Investment centers focus on returns. Return on assets, return on equity, equity return, project return, etc. Okay, kasi important rin na yung additional resources that they invested according to their decisions, will have ample income or return to the company. Okay. Now, when we talk about profit centers and investment centers, we're now looking at the concept of decentralization. Okay? Kasi kung yung iyong organisasyon is puro revenue centers lang at saka cost centers, ibig sabihin, yung mga responsibility units na yun does not control a lot of things. Right? So for example, ang design ng responsibility center mo is walang profit center. Ang profit center is at the corporate level lang. Each of the departments are only revenue or expense related. Okay? Dahil sila ay revenue centers and cost centers lang, it means they only have control in the specific revenue item and specific cost item that they are accountable to. They did not control a lot of things. Okay? And because they do not control a lot of things, a lot of the decisions are centralized. Tataas ka sa organization level or business unit level para magkaroon ka ng additional assets, for example. Okay? Or to relate revenue and cost, pupunta ka sa centralized level. When we talk about profit, more profit and investment centers, no, we are delving on the context of decentralization. Decentralization na yan. Kasi pag mas maraming profit centers sa organization, mas maraming investment centers, these investment centers need to control a lot of things. Right? If you're a profit center, what do you control? You control volume sold. You also control the selling price. You control the manufacturing cost. You control other discretionary costs. Discretionary costs include R&D, marketing, others. So, ibig sabihin, kung maraming profit centers, maraming tao have the responsibilities over this. Right? And therefore, decisions are way more decentralized. Okay? So therefore, if you decentralize more, those managers who have more decision authorities should have relevant information. Okay? Ngayon, kung wala namang relevant information, wag ka na mag-profit center. Right? Gawin mo na lang centralized operation. Okay? There should also be some way to measure the effectiveness of the trade-offs the manager has made, meaning trade-offs, meaning incremental analysis, right? Incremental analysis, remember your 117, right? Your management accounting. So trade-offs are incremental analysis. So each manager in a decentralized operation should be able to identify trade-offs or the financial impact of trade-offs. Kasi nakikita niya yung information sa sarili niyang P&L. Okay? What are some advantages of investment centers, meaning decentralization? Okay. Number one, the quality of decisions increase. Okay, why? Because pag di-decentralize mo, yung mga tao na pinag-decentralizan mo, they are closer to the business. They have local knowledge. They have on-the-ground knowledge. And therefore, they could increase the quality of decisions. Rather than na nagdi-decide yung nasa Ayala Triangle head office, hindi naman niya alam ang nangyayari sa planta sa Kabuyao or planta sa Davao. Right? Eh kung dinicentralize mo, yung plant manager sa Davao can decide. No? Kasi profit center na siya. Right? So, he can decide. And so therefore, if he can decide, he's there sa planta itself, supposed to be the quality of decisions increase. Decisions are also speedier. No? Kasi nandoon na siya eh. No? Ang lahat ng information nandoon na sa kanya sa Davao. Okay? So, hindi na niya kailangan tumawag sa central in Ayala Triangle to decide. Okay? And therefore, since some decisions are now delegated to the plant manager, for example, top management will have more focus on strategy. Okay? And of course, since they are deciding, it's an excellent training ground for general management pool. And of course, you increase profit consciousness within the organization. What are the disadvantages of profit or investment centers? Number one, when you delegate too much, yung top management becomes more naive on what's happening on the ground, right? And therefore, strategic decisions might be based on reports rather than actual personal knowledge of operations. So strategy, there could be a disconnect on overall corporate strategy. Okay. The quality of decisions made at unit level may be reduced, meaning the higher levels may be reduced. Okay. There could also be friction over setting transfer prices. We'll discuss more of transfer pricing next week. We'll discuss more of that and then characterize what is the function of the transfer pricing. Okay. Business unit competition may lead to dysfunctional decision making, meaning of course kung marami kang profit centers, marami kang managers, marami kang general managers, they might compete with each other. Okay? And so therefore, competition might be a good thing, but it could also be a bad thing. There's no camaraderie or cooperation among the different business units. Of course, if you also decentralize, you need more competent, mas marami, na competent general managers. And they may not exist kasi mababaw ang iyong talent pool in the organization. So that's also one problem. And there could also be too much emphasis on short-run profitability kasi hindi naman nakapag-strategic insighting yung mga plant manager. Ang strategic insighting nandoon sa central in the organization. Okay? What are some constraints on profit and investment center authority? Okay? So to realize the benefits of the profit and investment center concepts, a manager needs to be autonomous, meaning sufficient decision authorities are given to the manager. Okay? So organizations divided into completely independent units, usually they lose the advantage of size and synergy. So as you decentralize more, yung mga business units, they think on their own without thinking of the resources of other business units. And therefore, the economies of scale nawawala. And the idea behind synergy among these different units nawawala. So that's one cost or constraint of more authorities given to organization or to business units. Okay? It may also lead to top managements abdicating their own responsibilities. Oh, ikaw na mag-decide dyan, plant manager. Okay? Accountability mo yan eh. So yung nasa taas, pwede din na mag-decide. And responsibility center structures represent trade-offs between unit autonomy and corporate constraints. Let me illustrate that with this example. So this is the organizational structure of URC. Okay. So just for you to be familiarized, so there's the chairman, president, and CEO, and then URC has business units. Okay. So ano-ano yung business units nila? Branded and consumer foods. So yun yung snacks, noodles, and beverages. Flour and pasta, they have a flour business. May milling business ang URC. Matagal na yung milling business na yan. Sugar and renewables, sugar refineries and ethanol distillery are all combined. Kasi yung sugar, pag nagawa na, meron yung mga byproduct. The byproduct pwedeng gawing ethanol. Okay? Agro-industrial group, so hogs and poultry farming, and packaging divisions. Packaging ng mga pagkain. Okay? So these are organized as business units. So if they're organized as business units, baka these business units are all profit, or investment centers. Okay? Obviously, if you're the general manager for snack, you have accountabilities over revenues, right? You also have accountabilities over expenses and on assets. So yan yung investment centers. And I think that would be the case, most logical case for the other groups. Okay? Now let's look at the corporate center units. So meron pang corporate affairs, human resources. They all report to the chairman or the president and CEO. Okay? Accountable sila to the president and the chairman. Okay? So therefore, kung tutuusin, kung reporting sila dito, kunyari corporate affairs, reporting to the president. Pero yung brand and consumer good, kailangan din niya ng services ng corporate affairs. Right? kailangan ng services ng agro-industrial, may services from finance. Right? So yung output ng finance referring to the business units. Pero yung input, yung performance niya, accountable to the president and CEO. So that's something, that's a responsibility center design. No? In effect, finance here is an expense center. Yung input niya, cost, yung output niya, undefined. Or mahirap i-define or i-establish yung relationship. Okay? Ngayon, ibang usapan yan, okay? Ibang usapan yan, kung yung agro-industrial group within that organizational structure, pag binasag natin yung box na yan, sa loob ng agro-industrial group, mayroon palang box for finance. Right? If that's the case, then wala na tong relationship na to. Right? And so this finance box is only accountable to the activities of the holding company. Right? And therefore, some financial metrics are within the P&L responsibility of the agro-industrial group GM. Kasi meron siyang finance within his organization. So yung accountabilities ng lahat ng under sa kanya, accountability niya rin. Okay? What are some examples of accountabilities ng finance? For example, compliance, submissions of FS to the SEC. Okay? So that's a finance-related procedure or finance-related accountability. Right? Dun sa original kong case na walang finance dito, so dotted line ng finance, no, pag may non-compliance na naganap, no, the GM of the agro-industrial group is not accountable. Right? Kasi walang finance within his organization. So accountable is this finance na outside of his control. So, si agro-industrial group GM ba gusto ba niyang gusto ba niya maging accountable sa compliance? Eh hindi naman niya controlled 'yun, wala sa organization niya. So dapat tanggal 'yun sa kanyang efficiency or effectiveness measures. However, yung blue version, kung may finance function within agro-industrial group, walang masasabi si GM ng agro-industrial group. Right? Accountability mo rin yung compliance kasi may finance group ka within may finance department ka within agro-industrial group. Okay? So kung ganun yung design ng organisasyon, the responsibility should also follow that. So the GM should also be accountable to compliance because yung finance under sa kanya. And one of the accountabilities of finance is compliance to the SEC. Okay? If you look at the structure of URC, there's one very unique. Ito packaging. Kung isipin mo yung packaging, expense lang yan dapat, right? Expense ng branded consumer goods, flour pasta, kasi lahat ng other business units may packaging. Pwedeng bawat isang business unit may sariling packaging department, right? Pero meron siyang ibang packaging business unit, right? So yung isang usually expense center, na-transform niya into a profit center. Again, what did I say? Packaging is part of OPEX, part of manufacturing cost pala. Part of manufacturing cost of branded consumer goods, of flour, may packaging yung lahat. So under a normal business unit, ang maisip mo, yung packaging, isa lang siyang department within a plant. Right? And therefore, cost lang siya. So iniisip mo, engineered cost center yun dapat. Right? Pero in the organizational structure of URC, it is a separate business unit. It is a profit center. Right? Bakit kaya ganun? Okay? Kasi ang ginagawa nila, even though URC, itong packaging division na yan, ang ginagawa nila is this. Sino-charge nila yung They perform packaging services for all of these business units. Okay? So they perform services to these business units. Okay? And because URC Packaging Division was designed as a profit center and not a cost center, they must be accountable to profits. So hindi dapat expense that may revenue sila. So what happens now? These business units pay. No? They pay the packaging business unit with revenues. Okay? Since may revenues na siya, may expense, naging profit center na yung packaging division, which you will traditionally see as an engineered expense. Right? Ba't niya dinesign na ganun? Gusto niya kasing baguhin yung thinking ni packaging division. Right? Sa halip na expense center ka lang, gusto ko maging mas empowered ka, no, to expand your packaging expertise and packaging market, okay, by having profit responsibility instead of only an expense responsibility. Change natin yung mindset ni packaging division manager. Okay? So itong mga revenues na ito, ang tawag dito, this is called the transfer pricing. Kasi you are transferring goods and services within a group. Okay? So intercorporate transactions, okay? Intercorporate sales, right? Those are called transfer pricing in the context of management accounting. And what is the objective behind transfer prices? It transforms an expense center, a traditionally expense center department, into a profit center department. And it changes their thinking also. It changes the way they approach packaging. So ngayon, since they are a profit center, they can opt to provide services to other companies rather than just thinking of costs. Okay? Dahil profit center na sila, if itong mga branded consumer goods na to ay hindi nagbabayad ng magandang transfer price, okay? The packaging division can drop it, right? And sell to other and package or provide services to other organizations. Okay? That could be a pressure for the branded consumer group. Anong pressure sa branded consumer group in this case? It's either accept the price of the packaging division, or find a better supplier than the packaging division. So, nai-improve yung performance kasi meron din siyang profit responsibility. Okay? So, the presence of transfer prices among intercorporate or among a group of companies within the same umbrella, no, enhances the strategic thinking, enhances the value maximization thinking, no, of all these business units within the organization. Okay? So as we go to the cases, as we discuss more examples, we will be focusing more on that, and we will be focusing more on that when we discuss transfer pricing. Okay? In fact, if you look at the operating segments of URC, if you look at the operating segments of URC, no, iba lang yung definition ng operating segments, hindi katulad dun sa drawing kanina. No? So yung branded consumer food products daw, nandoon yung packaging division. Okay? So if we look at the operating segment disclosure, ito yung branded consumer goods, right? Maraming inter-segment revenues ang branded consumer goods, right? Okay? And those inter-segment revenues, meaning these are all revenues of the packaging division. These are the revenues of packaging division coming from the others na agro-industrial, commodity, etc. Okay? So nakita mo, merong intersegment transactions, and these 18 million na yan or 18 billion pesos, those are all transfer prices. Okay? So next week, we'll talk about more about transfer prices and what is its role, no, in transforming the nature of a responsibility center from expense to profit. Okay? Okay. That's it. Thank you.